been very interesting over the course of these 2 days, listening to the perspective from the policy side, the financial side, and the institutional side. It's been very interesting, especially from someone like me that comes more from the let's look at the data and what the numbers say side. So it was a bit ominous hearing you, Mr. Tanaka, saying that Jesus is back. So because it might mean something else, but let's get this show on the road. So it was interesting listening from the perspectives of everyone here, because what we are looking at is the perspective of energy policy in the context of everything else, in the context of the economy, in the context of technology, in the context of policymaking. So what we're looking at right now in Anthropocene is what happens when you try to get buy-in from every single stakeholder in the energy transition. So if you want buy-in, you need cheap, available, abundant, and clean energy. And that means that that also means that you need that cheap energy translates into better energy security and into better economic development and affordability, which is kind of a buzzword these day and ages. So if you want to look, if you're looking at energy demand and economic development, you have a very strong relationship between both. And if your energy generation is directly related to carbon emissions, then you're in big trouble. So you either tell the people on the upper right side to become poorer, that would be the degrowth, or you tell the people on the lower left to stay poor. Good luck playing that politics game. So what you need to do is look either deindustrialize, which the only thing that does is putting the problem somewhere else, and it's currently you can only do it once, and it's increasingly out of fashion. So what you need to do is break the relationship between carbon emissions and economic development. And that means a clean energy transition. And in that regard, nuclear energy is one of the ingredients that you must consider. It doesn't matter what else you have, you cannot resolve your problems without nuclear energy. So if you have it, keep it, or grow it, even better. If you don't, talk to many of the people in this room and ask them if you can get it through SMR reactors, or like I was discussing with Mr. Tanaka, thorium molten salt reactors, to which, personally, my personal bias, I am a convert. Also, nuclear energy can help soften external shocks, either from the COVID pandemic or from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which led Europe to lose their gas station in Russia and to start having to look somewhere else for alternative sources of natural gas. And internal decisions can also have a major impact on energy prices, like shutting down nuclear power plants and scheduled and unscheduled outages, which is one of the things that we focus on our research. So what, when, where, and how is that we looked at energy generation and pricing data from the EU and the United States, and we tried to look at the price variability during external shocks like the pandemic or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, internal shocks like nuclear power plant shutdowns, and be them scheduled and unscheduled power plant outages. So what we are seeing in the data is that losing nuclear power will end up leading you to move to higher carbon energy sources, so higher emissions in the short term. That's the case of Germany and Belgium. Also, losing nuclear power leads to higher and less stable electricity prices. We see that toujours. And keeping or expanding nuclear energy leads to reduced emissions and lower and more stable prices. That's the case of Finland. And shutdowns end up have lingering shocks in the pricing structure of energy markets. And as would be expected, scheduled shutdowns have a slower and lower impact that lingers even less than unscheduled outages. And that there is an untapped potential for nuclear energy in carbon credit markets, especially if you, like we were saying before, manage to expand your nuclear generation capacity. You are releasing you are stopping the emission of carbon emissions that can become carbon credits that if we open the door for nuclear energy in carbon credit markets. So, the first case is Germany, and we're going to beat that dead horse until it becomes glue. So, what happened between 2011 and 2024? We had the Germany's atomic exit, that they shut down all of their reactors, which led to, and Kaiser Wilhelm is right now spinning in his grave, we went from the marriage of iron and rye to the marriage of iron and gas, which led to Germany giving the keys to all of its industry to that guy. What could possibly go wrong? And fast forward a couple of years, and you have the German Chamber of Commerce and Industry complaining about nuclear, the loss of clean and cheap and stable electricity, and you get current Chancellor Merz basically saying that Atomausstieg was a serious strategic mistake, which is a very educated and circumspect way of saying, whoops. So what did we find? Again, Guido already gave his excellent talk on the subject, but I'm just going to remind everyone that we had a report with our colleagues at We Planet, in which we go ahead and explain all of the whole mess of Atomausstieg and all of its consequences. The one that I would like to point out that Guido didn't mention in his talk is that the carbon intensity of the German grid would have been much lower if they had kept their nuclear power plants, and instead it did drop indeed, but it would have been much, much smaller. So that's the part about Germany. We're also working on a refereed article, but that's running through the gears of referee number 2. Now accompany me please to Spain, where the sun is shining and there's no snow on the ground. Now, what happened between 2015 and 2024? There was a massive development in solar energy. It led to a massive drop in coal and natural gas and the burning of oil. They didn't have much of a drop in nuclear energy, fortunately, but right now they're getting pressure from activists to shut down one of their nuclear power plants in Almaraz. And in April 28th, 2025, we all heard the news. They had a massive electrical outage that took out the whole Iberian Peninsula in Spain and Portugal. There's some research being conducted by ENSOE, and we expect a report by mid-year. But overall, what we looked at was the impact of scheduled and unscheduled outages on energy prices. And for the most part, what we are seeing is that since Spain doesn't rely that much on nuclear energy and mostly relies on solar and wind, we're not seeing that much of a heavy impact when they have either a scheduled or unscheduled outage. Prices more or less keep a good predictive power over the course of an outage and even 6 weeks after an outage. The take home there is that while low reliance on nuclear energy, as would happen with any energy source, if you don't rely too much on it, if you lose it, you don't get a meaningful impact from it. But given the fact that nuclear energy can help you build the frequency of your grid, and it can serve as a backstop when you have any loss of synchronous generation, then you don't get the impact of the loss of nuclear energy on the price side, but you are by not having it, you're exposing yourself to grid instabilities that apparently seem to have led to the big blackout of the Iberian Peninsula. But again, we'll be waiting in anticipation that ENSOE report. Now Belgium, great chocolate, not so good energy decisions. What happened between those 2 years? They shut down Duel 3 and Tihange 2. And earlier on last year, they also shut down Duel 1 and 2, if I recall correctly. So they increased their dependence on natural gas, which eventually led to a little bit of a problem after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where Belgium lost its gas station and somehow missed the United States on the map. So it took them a while, and they managed to get gas from the US, which led to pretty much a tripling of LNG imports from the United States, which of course led to an increase in emissions, which they could have avoided. And again, like Guido was commenting on previously, that's money coming out of Belgian people's pockets. So someone has to pay for those carbon credits. Prices are also remain quite high. They're 100% above pre-pandemic levels. That was our reference point, because even though the pandemic didn't affect that much electricity generation, it changed the demand profile, because many people, those who could, moved from working in the office to working from home, and that has an impact on energy demand. Price variability is still at pandemic levels, so things haven't gotten back to normal yet. Now, what did we find with regards to outages? In the case of Belgium, that since they do rely a bit more on nuclear energy, even though they've had their shutdowns, nuclear outages do have a bit of a more sensible impact. We see that nuclear generation losses from shutting down power plants end up being replaced with carbon-intensive sources that thus increasing your emissions. The same story that we heard from the Germans. Nuclear shutdowns, again, lead you to end up relying on external suppliers, which can then rake you over the coals and get you to pay whatever they want. And nuclear power plant outages impact price predictability. That is expected. The unscheduled outages have a greater impact, even though they last less. But since the market doesn't expect them, they cannot price them in. And since scheduled outages are notified beforehand, the market can price them in more easily, and mitigating measures can be taken by the grid operators. And since Belgium relies a lot more on nuclear power than Spain, outages have a greater impact on prices. Now let's go to Finland, where heavy metals are only in the music and not in the emissions. So what happened in that time? Finland brought online Olkiluoto 3, adding quite a bit of generation. Nuclear power generates well above 39% of the energy that the Finns consume, followed by wind and hydro. It's a very similar profile to what we have here in Sweden. Olkiluoto 3 is the most powerful unit in Europe and the third one in the world, so kudos to that. It sounds fantastic. And unfortunately, it has had quite a rocky start. In our data set of unscheduled and scheduled outages, it ends up representing a third of all outages between 2015 and 2024. That's coming from one reactor. That's quite a lot. But one of the reasons that we have found that leads to those to the amount of scheduled and unscheduled outages, the scheduled ones are more connected to bringing online the reactor and safety protocols that need to be followed in order to ensure the continued functioning of the reactor. But the unscheduled ones, we have found that there has been a policy from the grid operator in Finland, Fingrid, that requires the manager of a nuclear power plant, or of a power plant in general, to supplement one-to-one their generation capacity with some sort of backstop coming from either pumped hydro, batteries, or what have you, in order to prevent the impact on the grid from losing the entire generation capacity of the power plant. Given that we're looking at the biggest nuclear reactor in Europe, that's quite the requirement. So that has led to the Finnish Energy Authority to start revising this requirement, and part of the labor that we have done here at the Anthropocene Institute is that we've shown this data to activists and to policymakers, and we have made recommendations to revise this policy, which is currently under revision, and to change it into something more attuned to the evidence of the capacity factor of each specific power source. What we have found with regards to the consequences of bringing Olkiluoto 3 online is that they reduced carbon emissions, even though it had a very stop and start deployment, by around 7.4 million tons of CO2, which, if you turn those into carbon credits, can become around 400, well above 400 million euro. And as in the case of Belgium, that was money coming out of the Belgian people's pockets, this is money that is going into the Finnish economy. Again, should the contribution of nuclear energy be accounted for in carbon credit markets. Now, up to the invasion of Ukraine, prices in Finland behaved somewhat similarly to those in Belgium. That's why we're comparing those two. But adding nuclear energy, I suppose, in contrast to what Belgium did of eliminating it, ended up leading prices to return to pre-pandemic, pre-invasion, and pretty close to pre-pandemic levels. The situation has almost normalized, although price variability in current times remains quite high, and partly that can be attributed to the issues with Olkiluoto 3, although, as we have seen in some talks beforehand, even today, some of the problems have also come from inclement weather affecting wind turbines. So, with regards to power plant outages, what did we find? So, like I said before, we have an overwhelming representation of Olkiluoto 3 in the numbers, but since Finland relies far more on nuclear energy than Belgium does, then the impact of outages is much more significant. So what we're seeing is that, again, the same pattern repeats itself. Unscheduled outages have a longer lived impact and a much bigger impact than scheduled ones. That's to be expected. However, what we're seeing is that the impact is enormous on price predictability. But pretty much even once generation is restored, you get problems. You get a loss of predictability in prices even 6 weeks after generation has been restored. So that goes to one of the arguments, one of the overarching ideas that we should get from what we're saying right now is that you should strive for attaining a diversified portfolio of energy generation. While nuclear is a very important part of that, if you rely solely on solar, you're going to have problems. If you rely only on nuclear, you're going to have problems. Monocultures are not good. It doesn't matter if you're doing agriculture or if you're doing energy policy. Try to avoid them. Also, again, the take-homes from what we learned from Finland is that Olkiluoto 3 has helped the Finnish grid drop energy prices, nearly returning to historical values, although, like I said before, the variability of prices remains quite high. It also helped Finland decrease their emissions, allowing for opening the door for a potential for carbon credits, but again, the laws need to be changed in order to allow nuclear power to be considered for the whole carbon credit market. The higher reliance on nuclear energy has made Finland much more vulnerable to outages. That's, again, to be expected. The staggered deployment of Olkiluoto 3 has also brought along quite important issues. Hopefully, the Finnish energy authorities will change their current position, and we are quite optimistic that that will be the case. But again, we'll wait and see what the results are from their investigations. And like we said before, we have made recommendations for them to follow an evidence-based policy, taking into account the capacity factor of every single nuclear energy source. They're not interchangeable. Capacity factor really does matter. Now, for the great state of California in the US, the main star in California in the energy markets is unfortunately natural gas, followed by solar, hydro, and nuclear, coming in not quite the rear, but close enough with 8%, because everything relies on the shoulders of the Diablo Canyon power plant. And as we have seen here at the Anthropocene Institute, both Carl and Guido have been quite active trying to fight the evil forces that try to shut down Diablo Canyon and make the state of California increasingly reliant on natural gas. One of the things that has happened in the whole debate about Diablo Canyon is that the operator PG&E, that is one of the main energy providers of the state, has been wanting to shut down the power plant, citing regulations that favor renewables but disfavor nuclear generation. However, the grid operator CAISO, the system operator, counters by saying that would cause a lot of problems. They're not wrong there, and many people have tried to counter that influence of trying to shut down Diablo Canyon. The last things I've seen is that there has been some extended operation of Diablo Canyon, but again, the fight's not over. What did we find with regards to outages? Unfortunately, California, the CAISO, the operator, does not publish information on outages. So we had to make do with what we had. We had generation information. So we had to work on a definition of an outage. We tried to keep it in consideration that an outage would be a period of, a scheduled outage would be a period in which there was refueling and regular maintenance lasting around a month. So we put our threshold there and started working from that. So we said that a scheduled outage would be any outage lasting more than 30 days, and an unscheduled outage would last far less. Using that definition, we find that the mean scheduled outage lasts well over 2 months, and the mean unscheduled outage, again defined as we do it, lasts around 5 days. And what we see is that, again, we're seeing again the fact that California doesn't rely that much on nuclear power, that an outage, either a scheduled one or an unscheduled one, doesn't have that much of an impact on prices. However, what we're fighting for is, and we will see that in my next example, is that even though you may not get a direct influence in prices from an outage or from a nuclear power plant, you can also get a negative influence through the back door by changing your energy profile. And that's the case of Sweden. Sweden shut down 2 reactors, Ringhals 1 and 2, and that led, if you can see there, we have a graph showing the 4 zones, the 4 pricing zones of the Swedish grid. You have 2 zones in the north, which are predominantly rural, and they predominantly produce wind and hydro electricity, and they tend to overproduce energy, whereas the 2 southern ones are the big urban centers, and they tend to overconsume. So originally, prior to the shutdowns of Ringhals 1 and 2, what we see is that the lines, the overproduction from the north was getting transferred effectively to the south, and more or less prices remained within control. That means that hydro in the north ended up becoming, the structure of the grid was that hydroelectric generation became a stabilizing force for prices and for generation, and nuclear generation also served as a second backstop to whatever variations from energy generation you got from wind. So you could think of the Swedish grid as a 3-legged stool, where each of the 3 main energy sources, hydro, wind, and nuclear, pretty much compensated one another effectively, keeping prices down. However, what we see is that in historical development, wind power starts to grow while nuclear energy drops because of the shutdowns of Ringhals 1 and 2. And here are the consequences. What we find is that as soon as the second reactor comes offline, prices between the northern zones and the southern ones decouple completely, meaning that now we are seeing a change of the structure of the Swedish grid, the behavior is changing completely, and the lost generation of Ringels 1 and 2 ends up being compensated by wind, with all the uncertainties that that entails. Without a stable backstop, what ends up happening is that generation from the north does not get effectively transmitted to the south, because now the south has excessive demand that is not being met. So that leads to much higher prices in the south, zones 3 and 4, that is unfortunately not being met appropriately from generation in the north. So now what ends up happening when you see which energy sources end up correlating with one another, what you see is that since one of the legs of the stool has gotten shorter, what ends up happening is that, well, the stool becomes a bit wobbly. So the main driver of price variability becomes wind energy, and now hydroelectric power has to backstop two energy sources, nuclear and wind, and there is not enough hydro to compensate for both. So that's one of the consequences of, unfortunately, losing nuclear generation, because if previously you had two backstops to the variabilities of wind generation, now you only have one, because now both wind and nuclear are proportional energy sources. So, wrapping up, these are the take-home messages. Like I said before, monocultures, bad in agriculture, bad in energy. So if we truly believe that we're in the midst of an energy crisis and in a climate change crisis, then we need all hands on deck. That includes nuclear energy. Lack of supply, not to be surprising, it's not surprised about it, but leads to price shocks, but so does price instability. If you cannot rely on the energy, it doesn't matter how much energy you have. If you cannot trust it, you're still going to end up paying more. Losing nuclear energy can lead to more coal and natural gas, and therefore to more carbon emissions. It's what Guido showed in Germany and what we have seen in Belgium. Power plants shutdowns, as expected, impact energy prices in proportion to their importance to the grid. We saw that was the case for Spain, that didn't rely that much on nuclear. It was a bigger impact on Belgium, that relied a bit more on nuclear, and the biggest impact was in Finland, that relies a lot on nuclear energy. Even if you looked at the best scenario possible, where you're replacing one source of clean energy with another, like Sweden has done, with replacing nuclear with wind power, you still can end up getting higher energy prices. Is what happens in California, because they have a lot of solar energy. But like I said before, it's what happened here in Sweden. Replacing megawatts of generation 1-to-1 is not exactly the best solution, because again, capacity factor matters. It's the difference between a nuclear reactor that has an above 90% capacity factor compared to wind power that has, on a good day, around 30%. Weather-dependent renewables do require quite a bit of investment in storage or in stable, clean generation as a backstop. Is this happening? Yes, it is. Is it large enough? Evidence points to no. And finally, nuclear energy. We have seen here that it can reduce carbon emissions. Is what we've seen in Finland, what we have seen a bit in Belgium, that when you take it out, your emissions go up. So why are they not eligible for carbon credit markets? Who's afraid of the nuclear cooties, to quote Guido? And what projects could be financed, again, from Guido's presentation, if nuclear energy would be eligible for those markets? Like Guido showed with line items from the German budget, what else could you do? Could you grow nuclear? Could you get more housing? What else could you do? Especially now that Europe is quite focused on reinvesting in itself. Your options are open. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think it is a kind of collective energy security, or collective energy, or collective sustainability policy of the European Union. Your model can prove some kind of benefits of this connectivity among European countries?
Currently, No, we have not looked at that thoroughly. However, one of the things that we have seen in the data is the following: that whenever you can look at the grid in the following fashion: that you can have a stable source of generation like nuclear, hydro, the big generation sources. If you have that, the risk, the uncertainty lies within them. But as soon as you try to move to decentralized, weather-dependent sources of energy, then now the risk is moving from the generator to the grid. And now the grid has the burden of managing between the different power sources, also the battery backstops and the rebalancing with interconnects. So if you want to have an energy transition that relies on decentralized sources of energy, then you have to make the investment on having a smart grid and backstops either with batteries, pumped hydro, or something else that can manage the balance. Otherwise, you may have a situation like the one in Spain.
Sure. Yeah, well, I want you to do more study about that because ASEAN countries are connecting grid each other. And I'm promoting the idea of connecting Japan, Korea, China, or these Far East Asian connectivity concept. So I want to know if it's really a good thing or bad thing. Just I'm curious.
On broad terms, what I would say is the following: a decentralized grid, a more distributed grid, has the advantage of being very robust against shocks.
Okay.
However, you run into the problem of coordination.
Sure, that's true.
So it's important.
Beyond borders, coordination is really tough.
Yeah.
In geopolitics and that. Is there any questions? If not,
Clear as mud.
Jesus, thank you very much. Very interesting work and very interesting analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you.